Bioweapons. Was Ukraine some kind of Silicon Valley for bioweapons? And what's the connection between gain-of-function research and bioweapons? RFK's got some interesting things to say. Hello there, you 6.5 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this incredible voyage to truth and freedom that we're undertaking together in the midst of geopolitical fracture, in the midst of propaganda, censorship and surveillance, in the midst of endeavours that seem so potentially dangerous we must be mad to tolerate them. Today we're talking about Tucker Carlson's conversation with RFK, in which RFK spoke about the biolabs in Ukraine. Now remember, at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in conspiracy land, lots of people saying there's bioweapons over there, there's biolabs, people are making bioweapons, and that was one of those things that got sort of shut down. Then it started to be incrementally built upon in a slightly more diplomatic way, like, what about that Victoria Nuland? She's worked for successive administrations and she was involved in the 2014 events in Ukraine that led to that change of government. Don't call it a coup. So we're starting to see more and more, I believe, the intersection of giddy wild conspiracy theories and then sort of rather more mundane bureaucratic manipulation, and frankly what amounts to American foreign policy, using various sites across the world to create either pharmaceutical opportunity, let's call it, or bioweapons. And is there an intersection between gain-of-function research and bioweapons? In short, is gain-of-function research essentially about creating bioweapons? As I understand gain-of-function research is by taking something that's an horrible, nasty little virus and go, this little virus, sure what I think, go on. It's not bad enough. Let's make it worse. Let's have a look at Tucker Carlson and RFK's conversation and get into this in depth.
The fact remains there are U.S. biolabs in Ukraine. Why would we have biolabs in Ukraine?
We have biolabs in Ukraine because we're developing bioweapons. And those bioweapons are using all kinds of new synthetic biology and CRISPR technology and genetic engineering techniques that were not available to previous generation, and they can make frightening stuff.
A top-line consideration is whether or not you want bioweapons being developed. Are we not already in a precipitous state when it comes to global warfare? Don't we already have enough nuclear weapons to annihilate the planet many times over? Have we not recently seen the dangers of meddling in nature's domain, if you believe the Wuhan lab leak theory, for example, which hasn't been proven yet but seems increasingly likely, is probably in some way or another funded by your tax dollars, bioweapons. I don't know how else they're functioning. I don't know if they're doing fun runs or sort of car washes to raise money for these bioweapons. Presumably it's coming from American taxpayers at some point. When do we get to ask fundamental questions about how we want our civilization to be run? We just accept the fact that we're subject to the whims of global corporatism. That's what much of the frustration and tension is, I believe, that's not even articulately expressed. When you're dismissive of like MAGA people in their caps or people protesting for a whole host of reasons in the streets of the United States, there's a sense that things aren't right, things ain't fair, these institutions don't care about us, they're not listening, I'm angry. And just because you can't say what it is really is global corporations have taken over our democratic institutions, spend money abroad on things I don't care about and might actually be detrimental not only to my life but the life of the planet itself, and I'm sick of it, why don't I ever get to vote for it? How come I'm paying $700 towards relief for the Hawaii fires and yet $900 per annum so far on funding the Ukraine war? How much of that goes to biolab technology? Why did they lie about it in the first place? So many questions. You know what they'll say publicly? These biolabs, they're not dangerous, there's nothing to worry about. Why don't you want the Russians getting your hands on them then? Well, the Russians, you can't trust those guys. If in those biolabs all they're doing is racing mice through a maze, why are they so worried about the Russians getting in? Do you know what the Russians getting in there? What if they meddle with my most favorite mouses? They can't simultaneously be doing innocuous and innocent mouse experiments in those biolabs and be really worried that the Russians are going to get in there, can they?
When the Patriot Act reopened the bioweapons arms race in 2001, the Pentagon began putting a lot of money into bioweapons, but they were nervous at that time because if you violate the Geneva Convention, it's a hanging offense. And they weren't sure that that provision in the Patriot Act would actually hold up as a loophole to treaties that had been ratified by Congress. So they were nervous about actually going full force into bioweapons development. So they transferred the authority for biosecurity to one agency in the HHS called the National Institute for Infectious and Allergic Diseases, run by Anthony Fauci. So Anthony Fauci got all the responsibility for bioweapons development. He got at that time a 68% raise from the Pentagon in order to do that work.
When you hear a story like that, you realize there's more to political corruption within American governmental institutions than just Donald Trump saying that he won an election that other people say he didn't win. It seems that there's more complexity to it, because you don't really want someone who's in charge of a medical and health organization taking huge funds, getting huge pay rises, involved in gain of function research, involved in things that might be bioweapons that take their funding from confusing agencies that have relationships with big pharma. That's not the kind of clarity that we could have in our institutions, and I would argue should have. This is a health organization, so what do they do then? Well, they're solely focused on the well-being, welfare, and good health of American people. Also on the side, they're making terrifying weapons. That's not how you want it run. And do you notice that the Patriot Act was almost like the COVID of its age? There was a massive crisis, an emergency in the form of the 9/11 attacks, and it was utilized to introduce a raft of regulation that meant that we could be surveilled, that meant that we could be censored, that meant we could be observed, that meant that people could be arrested for espionage under what increasingly looked like questionable circumstances. And also, somehow, they went, we're going to start a bunch of biolabs. Is it likely, let me know in the comments in the chat below, that the COVID pandemic was used in a similar way to introduce regulations, legislations, and ideas that previously people would have rejected out of hand as being an infringement on our civil rights? When there's an emergency or a crisis, it's used to create opportunities. And the Patriot Act, which pertains to an event 22 years ago now, is still being utilized to respond to what? Saddam Hussein still might have weapons of mass destruction.
Every bioweapon needs a vaccine, so you develop them side by side, because in 100% of the cases when you deploy a bioweapon, there's blowback. Your side also gets sick. So in order to deploy one offensively, you need a vaccine to counter it. So you need to vaccinate your team before you deploy it.
Is this one of those moments where we could step back as a species and say, are we heading in the right direction? Where you've got laboratories, where one part of the laboratory going, we're going to invent the most lethal, deadly, awful weapons to destroy the lives of innocent people abroad who we temporarily at this time don't agree with. You guys over there, come up with a vaccine for that, because it's inevitable, 100% likely in fact, that we're all going to get sick from this crazy thing. Who's funding this? You are!
We spray her with the hose, leaving us relatively dry. Relatively? Well, there's bound to be some splashback.
So those two things are developed through a field of science called gain of function science, where you take an infectious microbe and you amplify its infectivity, or you make it jump species, so it may kill monkeys, now you make it kill humans, and you adopt it that way. And there's all kinds of methods, and then you make it immune to antibiotics and to therapeutic drugs and to other therapies. So it's actually the inverse of medicine.
When I hear that explained, it's like if someone explained the concept of the monarchy to me now. Like, what we're going to do is we're going to get a microbe that's deadly, that's killing monkeys. Yes, and cure those monkeys, right? Because we all love monkeys. No, we're going to make it worse. Oh, poor monkeys. I've not finished yet. I make it infectious to not us and our children. Yes, us and our children. Don't worry, there's some guys over there working on a vaccine. How's it going, guys? It's going expensive. Ah! If someone said, should we have kings and queens that we fund? I go, no, don't bother. Don't bother. It's a waste of money. Should we have a review around how we're organising society? No, let's keep it as it is. Maybe we can have it a bit different, but not much.
For 2,800 years since Hippocrates, doctors have been trying to figure out how to make microbes less infectious and less deadly, and developed antibiotics and therapeutics to do that. Well, the guys who are involved in this, there's 36,000 what are called life scientists, but they're actually death scientists, who are now employed full-time in developing, microbes that can be used to kill people.
How was work today? Quite good. What did you do? You know deadly viruses? Yes. Well, I made them much worse. Night. Did you wash your hands? No need. We've developed a vaccine. You can have it for free. I bought one home. But everyone else, let's have a look at this in more detail. The US military outsourced some of its biological weapons research to the government installed by the 2014 coup in Kiev, Democrat presidential hopeful Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said in an interview. Isn't it ridiculous that we can't go, no, they would never do. The American government create biolabs in an unstable territory adjacent to a historic enemy? You can't rule it out, can you, as a possibility? This will probably get called conspiracy theory, fake news. It certainly did a few years ago, or at the beginning of the pandemic era and the beginning of the war and all this constant rolling, never-ending crisis that all seem to be snowballing into one another now, like gain of function research. It's like, get a news story, make it a bit worse. Here's your new news story. Ah! According to Kennedy, the bioweapons program has operated under the guise of life sciences research, such as gain-of-function experiments on viruses and other pathogens, ultimately overseen by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who headed the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases between 1984 and 2022. At the beginning of this, he gave so many public speeches and appearances that were sort of conciliatory and consoling, like he was just sort of Uncle Anthony Fauci. How are we going to handle this? How are we going to handle this? Well, you know, wash your hands, keep distance, wear your mask. If you need to go out, you can go out. Like, you know, it was all very sort of kind of friendly and avuncular. It's demonstrable that this is someone who's involved in gain-of-function research, serious and heavy payments.
Dr. Fauci, give us vaccines.
He's not the kind of shaved Santa Claus that we represent. People were dancing around singing songs about him. I think he was on talk shows as a sort of celebrity. It's ridiculous. This is what happens when you have massive, centralized, authoritarian, globalist, corporatist systems that never ask people, the very people that are funding it, whether what they're doing is what those people want. And that applies to this ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, research of this nature, the response to the pandemic, institutions like the WHO and NATO. You might not want them, but you're funding them. I think we should have political parties that are going, listen, do you want this stuff? Because some of it seems a bit corrupt. Because I don't know anyone who's like, I love paying taxes. At best, you're like, I pay my taxes because it's the law, and I hope on some level it's helping people, like kids or hospitals or something. You work all day. You don't even get an invoice, do you? You don't even get a breakdown of, so what did you spend it on, guys? Let's have a look. Buyout what? We can't do this complex content without the support of our sponsors. Can you imagine what it's like being us and going, oh, can we have some money, please? And tell me, what do you guys do? We say, bring down the corporatist state, bring down the system. Here, have some money. We can't go to Pfizer. We can't go to Lockheed Martin. We go to these guys. Stay to the end of the ad. I'll make it funny, baby. Now, if you want to cheat death and cheat sweet lady time herself, you're going to need to look after your skin. That is why I'm recommending Genucell Skincare. We need sponsors like Genucell Skincare. It's hard for us to get sponsors because we're radical and we're anti-corporate and all that stuff. Now, these guys at Genucell want you to look and feel your best. You're going to look young and gorgeous. That's why they've introduced their 3-step dark spot luxury system that works in just 3 minutes. Have you got 3 minutes? Stay there. If you're bothered by dark spots on your face or liver spots on your hideous hands, neck and chest, then this is the way to watch them disappear safely and quickly. Just before this video, I was just one enormous liver spot. I've smothered myself in Genucell. I've drunk down a pint of the stuff. I've never looked more beautiful. Their luxury system contains a dark spot corrector. Correct those dark spots. Some fancy sounding microdermabrasion and collagen builder thrown in for good measure. That's why I'm looking so cool. And if you're not blown away by the results, you get your money back. You might go, hold on a minute, I'm still as hideous as I was yestermorn. So go to genucell.com/brand to order their new dark spot treatment system today and say goodbye to those pesky, stinking, wretched spots tomorrow. And as a special bonus, all 3 products are included in Genucell's most popular package for August. So you'll get their bags and puffiness serum also included, all for 70% off the retail price. Just go to genucell.com/brand. When some of these bugs escaped from laboratories in the US back in 2014, the Obama administration banned gain-of-function research, Kennedy added, so Fauci outsourced it overseas. Well, that can't lead to any problems unless there's a war and it leaks out of the labs because they're not properly looked after. Hopefully all that information isn't somehow being lost. 2019, Wuhan. A lot of them went to Ukraine, Kennedy told Carlson. I don't really want to hear Ukraine connected to anything other than there's this war there where Russia criminally invaded them and there's a humanitarian effort to support the people of Ukraine. Who's not down with that? We're all down with that, right? But then you sort of hear, oh God, another thing about Ukraine you should know, the president's son's got all sorts of really favourable deals with their energy companies. Oh, another thing, the American government have got a bunch of biolabs over there. I mean, like, what's next about Ukraine are we going to learn? A lot of them went to Ukraine, Kennedy told Carlson. While some of the research was moved to Wuhan, China laboratory, the suspected origination point for the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, these are sort of places that are on the news a lot, aren't they? Like Wuhan, Ukraine. What's the first thing you think of Ukraine? There's this war there where American taxpayers are funding it. Good. What's the first thing about Wuhan? Well, I've only really heard of Wuhan. Terrible wet markets. Do be careful in those wet markets. You could pick up something disgusting. But at a price that's right. Most of the research was funded by the Pentagon. That's weird, isn't it? Or by USAID, which Kennedy described as a CIA cutout. That's extraordinary. So the deep state fund secondary agencies subcontract out to opaque, obscure endeavours that are difficult to understand an inventory. Certainly it's not the kind of transparency and clarity that Joe Biden was promising when he marched gleefully into office, is it? The US has long dismissed claims about the biological research laboratories in Ukraine as Russian propaganda, until senior State Department official Victoria Nuland confirmed their existence at a 2022 Senate hearing. The Pentagon continues to insist the research is neither illegal nor intended for military purposes. Okay, so we're just doing some research in Ukraine.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of.
Isn't it odd what malevolence looks like these days? Just a nice, friendly-looking woman in a cardigan talking about biolabs in Ukraine and the concern that Russia might get hold of it while nervously fiddling with her pen. In this also is the modern assumption that there's nothing wrong with biolabs when America's in control of them, but if Russia's in control of them, suddenly they're bad. Either cluster bombs and biolabs are bad, or they're not. And we have to recognise that this is the kind of nihilism and lack of principles that's leading to the general dystopic feelings of a society falling apart that many of us are experiencing even beyond the confines of this mad conflict. If there's nothing to worry about in those biolabs, why is it a problem if Russia gets there?
So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
What you're being asked to believe is that there's some fundamental difference between American research and Russian conduct. Like the Americans, come on guys, let's just create some new medicines to help everybody. Let's make this virus a bit worse, then make a vaccine so we can just help people. Wait a minute, we could use this to create a super weapon. It's not like it had an innocent purpose and then Russia is the agent of change and malevolence. It's plainly a pretty secretive and malfeasant endeavour that takes place on foreign soil because under the Obama administration it was decreed to be too dangerous to do in America. So they, as part of their deal presumably of supporting the 2014 coup that Victoria Nuland was by coincidence involved with, they're able to continue doing at least gain-of-function research, which according to RFK is synonymous with creating weapons. And in a way, if gain-of-function means you take a biological substance and you give it the ability to cross species, or you make it more infectious and bad and just hope to God that those guys in Wuhan are washing their hands and keeping the windows shut, that is a type of weapon. It's certainly irresponsible. Where I like to invite you to come with me is broad out and go, do you want this even happening? Can't we be doing something else? I find it offensive. Nuland's bizarre admission that Ukraine has biological research facilities that are dangerous enough to warrant concern that they could fall into Russian hands ironically constituted more decisive evidence of the existence of such programs in Ukraine than what was offered in 2002 and 2003 to corroborate US allegations about Saddam's chemical and biological programs in Iraq. Wow, that's more evidence than the world went to war on 20 years ago. That's a good way of putting it. Any attempt to claim that Ukraine's biological facilities are just benign and standard medical labs is negated by Nuland's explicitly grave concern that Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of those facilities and that the US government therefore is right this minute working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces. What we're being invited to believe is it was an entirely innocent enterprise, but actually though, the Russians, they'd be able to put this in that jar and switch that on and turn on the Bunsen burner and knock over the mouse's cage and oh no, they've got a missile. That's what we're being invited to believe. And there's no doubt that like a bad person or a bad set of people could use almost anything to create chaos. But what I'm arguing is that the bad people are already doing that and you're funding it. The only reason to be quite concerned about these biological research facilities falling into Russian hands is if they contain sophisticated materials that Russian scientists have not yet developed on their own, which could be used for nefarious purposes, i.e. either advanced biological weapons or dual-use research that has the potential to be weaponized. You see how we're all having to develop this new vocabulary and get this new education? When I first heard dual-use research, it was reading RFK's book, and at that point it was like, oh god, this is a bit out there, isn't it? Even though it's obviously really thoroughly researched and actually quite dense. It's not a frivolous piece of writing, it's just some of the concepts and ideas in there are so out there, you think that can't be true. And then you just, a few weeks later, you read it in the news or you see a congressional hearing and you go, we're a bit worried about some of the stuff in the labs we might have left over there. If that fell into the wrong hands. I guess what I'm saying is now my starting point is they're probably up to some malevolent shit and they're probably going to lie about it. We probably have to break down all of these agencies and have a real overview of what it means to be America or the United Kingdom or whatever your country is. And go, is this what you want? Who is it now we're supposed to be scared of? Who's scarier than these lunatics that are there doing gain of function research and dual research and creating these labs and then having to admit, oh, sorry, we were involved in 2014 and oh, yes, we did have biolabs. The only way you could trust them is if on day one of the war, Joe Biden had gone, listen, this is a bit mental actually, because like Ukraine and Russia, you can see there's an escalating tension there. And I think morally we should support Ukraine because they're decent people and Russia are the aggressor in this instance. I've got to be honest though, we provoked them in 2014. We reneged on a deal we had not to infringe on former Soviet Union territories. We've got biolabs in Ukraine we're going to have to be double careful of. And one of my kids has got a cracking job at Burisma. He didn't say that, did he? So now that it's all coming out, I think, you fucking liars! What is in those Ukrainian biological labs that makes them so worrisome and dangerous? And did the US assistance extend to construction and development to the biological research facilities themselves? All we're doing over there is making L'Oreal lipsticks for little mice. And those labs are just mice and rabbits smothered in lipstick. But if the Russians get hold of those sexy mice and rabbits, there's no telling what they'll do. The indisputable reality is that despite long-standing international conventions banning development of biological weapons, all large, powerful countries conduct research that, at the very least, has the capacity to be converted into biological weapons. The work conducted under the guise of defensive research can, and sometimes is, easily converted into the banned weapons themselves. Recall that according to the FBI, the 2001 anthrax attacks that terrorized the nation came from a US Army research scientist, Dr. Bruce Ivins, working at the US Army's Infectious Disease Research Lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. The claim was that the Army was merely conducting defensive research to find vaccines and other protections against weaponized anthrax, but to do so, the Army had to create highly weaponized anthrax strains, which Ivins then unleashed as a weapon. The lesson about the severe dangers of so-called dual-use research into biological weapons was relearned over the last 2 years as a result of the COVID pandemic. While the origins of that virus have not yet been proven with dispositive evidence, though remember, fact-checkers declared early on it was definitively established that it came from species jumping and that any suggestion of a lab leak was a conspiracy theory, what is certain is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was manipulating various coronavirus strains to make them more contagious and lethal. The justification was that doing so is necessary to study how vaccines could be developed. But regardless of intent, cultivating dangerous biological strains has the capacity to kill huge numbers of people. All of this illustrates that research that is classified as defensive can easily be converted, deliberately or otherwise, into extremely destructive biological weapons. Does any of this remind you of another story? Are there some names that keep recurring? Let's go a little deeper into this. Senator Rand Paul has referred Dr. Anthony Fauci to the Justice Department for investigation into possible criminal prosecution for allegedly lying under oath to Congress about his knowledge of gain-of-function research conducted at China's Wuhan virus lab. So there you have it. Two of the most preeminent, dominant news stories of recent times appear to have peculiar and confusing elements. No wonder there's a march to censor and control independent media and the ability to communicate and discuss all facets of complicated stories like these, when continually we see stories that are first dismissed as conspiracy theories down the line become more and more demonstrably true, or at least worthy of consideration. As Glenn Greenwald demonstrated there, the story of the Wuhan lab leak went from being something that was simply dismissed to something that seems increasingly plausible. As with Tucker's conversation with RFK, biolabs was once the preserve of nut jobs like you and me, sat in our tinfoil hats wondering about why the world seems so unfair and how certain disasters appear to benefit certain interests while annihilating life for ordinary people. But don't these laboratories give you the perfect metaphor? Irresponsible, for-profit research that advances the interests of the military-industrial complex that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could be devastating for the world. Isn't that the very kind of unchecked power that we need to stop through new democratic processes, through a new manifesto of politics, through new changes, through new politicians, I hope like RFK, that would bring these practices to an end right now. They're costly, they're dangerous, they should stop. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments in the chat? If you like this video, have a look at either of these two. Remember, turn on the notification bell and subscribe. Watch our show in the other place. We stream every day. And if you're a football fan, football is nice. It's a fantastic distraction from all of this craziness. More important than any of that, though, is if you can, please stay free.